Good evening, everyone. Dan here from Collective Shout. Tonight, we're continuing our series, Reimagining Masculinity, Conversations with Men Challenging Porn Culture. For this conversation, we have a special guest, and due to the nature of the topic and the willingness of our guest to speak frankly about his own personal experience, he will remain unidentifiable. So for context, and this is the bio that James has sent through to me, James is a recovering porn addict from the UK who helps other men with problematic sexual behaviour as part of a sex addiction fellowship. This work and his own experience have given him an insight into how damaging the sex industry and pornography is to both women and men. And this has spurred him on to address these issues and by working with us here at Collective Shout. He's also an occasional contributor to the Collective Shout blog, which I would have shared an article this week. James, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you for having me, Dan. I'm very grateful. Thank you.
Can I ask, how did you come across Collective Shout?
So when I had decided that I no longer wanted to engage in this kind of behavior, so watching pornography, etc., I was immersed in porn culture for years, and I felt like there was a remedy to that, and I had to seek the messages that were counter and against the porn culture. And one of the big problems with this issue is the objectification of women and the commodification of women, and seeing women as commodities and objects purely for male pleasure. And one of the leading voices on that particular issue specifically is Collective Shout. Their blog and their material and their campaigning is all about the objectification of women. So as I was early in my recovery, I immersed myself in Collective Shout's material, not just Collective Shout's, other people's as well, but Collective Shout in particular do address this issue of objectification really, really well. So that's really how I came to be aware of their work.
That's fantastic. I'm sure the team would love, and be encouraged to hear that. Can I ask, what was your tipping point though? How did you come to the point where you realized pornography was taking you down a dark place, that you wanted to seek out these resources?
Sure. So I've never been really that comfortable with my porn use. It always was something that I did to get away from feelings, to get away from life, to get away from things. And after I got married, I said to myself, this is it, I'm going to stop. And I couldn't stop. And then other situations in my life happened, unemployment, trying to get work, and I couldn't stop. Every time some situation in my life took a turn for the worse, I'd go back to my porn and my addiction, and I just could not stop. I kept trying, and I just couldn't. And it got to a point where I'd started becoming more established professionally. And, being married to a professional woman as well, having made a lot of female friends within my sphere professionally, and I was still using porn. And by that point in my porn use, I'd escalated to the kind of porn scenarios that I guess, and a trigger warning for anybody, I guess they involved more things like coercion and violating women's boundaries. So, for example, scenarios where, for example, there's a boss and he won't promote a woman unless she has sex with him, or there's a taxi driver and he will report her to the police for not paying the fare unless she has sex with him. There's a student and she won't get the grades she needs unless she has sex with the teacher. These kinds of elements of coercion and coercive scenarios, I thought, I've always been quite progressive, and I've always been in favor of women's rights and advancement of women in the workplace. And I have female friends, and I thought, I can't at the same time have these progressive beliefs about women and allow myself to be aroused by scenarios where women are really being abused and oppressed and used. And it kind of got to the point where I couldn't contain these two things, and I had to do something about it. I just wasn't comfortable with this. So I just had to seek a lot of help, and then that's when I decided to quit, and thankfully I'm still sober. So it's been a real journey for me, which I'm prepared to talk more about. But that was the tipping point for me.
Yeah, thank you, James. Appreciate you sharing openly and authentically. I think we obviously need to have these conversations so that other men can feel comfortable to acknowledge that they have a problem and speak
Oh,
publicly
absolutely.
about it, or obviously not necessarily in a broadcast sense, but to be able to be open up to even mates or a close confidant. You write about this issue, and obviously it must be regarding what you've just shared, that it radicalizes men. It's a very strong word. Can you explain that a little bit more when you say that it radicalizes
Yeah,
men?
sure. So when one reads about terrorist organizations and militant groups online and in the news and things, one theme that stands out is, in order to allow a person, a man, to be able to enact violence or or murder on other fellow human beings, these groups immerse their recruits in really violent movies and material that kind of gives people in their mind permission to allow them to enact violence and these things on other human beings. And in my own experience of being in a sex addicts fellowship, when I met dozens and dozens of men with similar problems, and not just addiction like myself, but porn addiction, but also problems with the law. So people that have been arrested for various sexual offences and violence against women, and different illegal behaviours. Many men. The thing that stood out for me really was that one thing they all had in common, all of these guys that were coming to these meetings and these people we were, trying to deal with this problem, is porn use. And
Wow.
there was kind of a similarity for me. If you're immersed in a culture that objectifies, dehumanizes, and enacts violence against women, you will eventually lose the kind of inbuilt restrictions and restraints that you have on violence and the kind of things, problematic behavior against women, in the same way that if you immerse yourself in violent subcultures, you will be more open to committing violence against other people. A similar thing, I think, is taking place with porn culture, where, as I just said, you immerse yourself in, you start seeing women differently. And that's what I mean when I say radicalization. And the difference is, the really big difference between watching violent videos and watching violent pornography is, if you're watching violent pornography, you're probably masturbating as well. And that's one of the biggest reinforcing behaviors to watching anything. So you could be watching a video of roses and masturbating, you'd be aroused by the image of roses. Similarly, if you're watching a woman getting smacked around and you're masturbating to that, you will eventually become aroused to imagery of violence against women. And that's very problematic. And this is what I mean. Radicalization sounds like a strong term, but I don't really think it's that strong when we break down and consider exactly what's taking place.
Yes, absolutely. No, it's harrowing having you unpack that, but it's so true. I read a story this week where, men are more likely to obviously adopt rape myths, and to believe that they're more likely, according to this AIHW report here in Australia, to be sexually violent, like young men that watch pornography, and to push past, consent. So I get that. I've seen the literature on it. I just had never used the word radicalize, but it very much fits that pattern. It's very much used as a grooming tool, both to groom women to their own abuse, but obviously it works for men. And as you note, compared to other forms of limbic capitalism, it has the added, impact of orgasms and masturbation to rewire neural pathways. So it's it's so powerful compared to even gambling or other things that impact our brains with, reward systems. So I get that. And, I think that language is really powerful. Can I ask, so in terms of you going out and seeking help, was this group a first step, or what part of it was it before you decided that you needed to actually join a fellowship group for sex addicts?
Yeah. Yeah, this is the thing, and it's quite a common theme with many addicts, whereby you're in denial for as long as you can be in denial for. And I always had problems with depression, and I thought if I dealt with my problems with depression, then this whole problem would go away. So first, I sought counselling and a proper specialist psychosexual counsellor. And when I delved into the problems deeper, she suggested to me, you really need to get some therapy. So I got some therapy, which I still go to therapy, but much less regularly than I used to. And she also recommended that I join a fellowship because when I related the depth of my use, and it had, so I wasn't using so much when I sought help. It was just more the case that I couldn't stop when I started. Like any alcoholic or gambling addict or drug addict, as soon as, my life was in a good place, but as soon as something slight just upset me or annoyed me, the first thing I'd be going to look for is some porn. And it's just not a healthy way to live. So she said that I really needed to get some help from a 12-step group, and I did. And it was incredibly beneficial for me.
For you personally, like, what are the other men that you've met there? And, is it possible for all men to quit porn?
Yeah, absolutely. So I've met lots and lots of men through these sorts of groups and these meetings, and some of them are people that they are addicted to porn and they want to stop. Others are people that have, like I said earlier, they've been convicted of sexual offences, or they're going to be convicted of sexual offences and they want to stop. And like I say, the one thing that unites almost just about everybody that I've met in these meetings is life started out pretty good for a lot of these guys. They have jobs, careers, families, and their go-to kind of de-stress, unwind was porn. And then life takes a turn for the worse, porn use escalates, and then they just can't stop. And then life as it is, it goes up and down, and escalation takes place. And years later, many are doing things that they never even conceived they would. And it's that whole first step to a lot of these guys' problems was just addictive porn use and porn use in general. And this is the reason I really wanted to get involved with Collective Shout's work, was because I see this all the time and I don't see anybody doing anything about it. Governments know this is a problem. Healthcare providers know it's a problem, but it's really in the public perception or public discussion. And it's something that really needs more discussion and more light shone on it if we're really going to do anything about it.
Yeah, absolutely. To jump back to a point that you made. So you were saying that these guys were fairly regular chaps who then, because of porn, were now, I get the picture without putting words in your mouth, like committing crimes or on the verge of.
Yeah. But some of them also have problems with paying for sex or voyeurism, and just any kind of thing you can imagine that would make you clutch your pearls if you read it in a newspaper. That's what a lot of these guys are involved in. I'm at the sharp end of this. Like, really, like when I talk about having to help and deal with people with sexual problems, it really is as bad as you can imagine. That's the kind of people that I work with and that I've met and I talk to regularly.
And are they a diverse group? Are they?
Yeah.
Okay.
They all come from different professional backgrounds, different ethnic backgrounds, different educational backgrounds, different family backgrounds. Some of them had pretty poor childhoods, like I did. Some of them had come from completely brilliant childhoods, went to private school. It's not the only one strand. And like I say, I'm not a sociologist. I'm not somebody who has studied this or quantified this. But the more guys I talk to within this fellowship, like I say, the one thing that unites everybody is initially porn use. That's the one thing that if I was to pick one thing that everybody had in common, it's porn use, and maybe even premature porn use. So you before the age of 18.
Yeah. Yeah, that's extraordinary. And it matches a lot of what the global research is saying. I remember reading Dr. Gail Dines. She went and interviewed child sex offenders in
Mm,
prison, and her experience testifies to this, where these men just continued to use your language, radicalize or use escalating, extreme pornography until they started to
mm,
look at child sexual abuse material. And she
uh-huh,
said that, yeah, it was only a matter of time between them going from, so to speak, mainstream pornography to far more nefarious, to completely abhorrent things, and then to actually
yeah.
acting that out in the real world.
No, that's absolutely the case. It's an escalating behavior at the end of the day, and the real evidence for me, the real evidence that it's an escalating behavior, is how different modern porn looks to 80s porn, for
Yeah.
example, or 70s porn. I mean, you compare, and this is not an argument at all in any way in favor of milder porn or softer porn or feminist porn or ethical porn, any of this nonsense. It's more, you just look at how the consumer's tastes have changed over the past 20 years, and it's not like a lot of the porn now just isn't really porn. It's videos of violence against women with some erections thrown in. It really is appalling, and that for me is the number one evidence that this is escalating, because the consumer has escalated. I mean, there's so many themes now in mainstream pornography that just didn't exist
Yeah.
20 years ago. So I mean, I got into this stuff nearly 17, 18 years ago or so.
Yeah.
And I
Phew.
mean, there's just themes out there now that are so ordinary and mainstream,
Yeah.
that are just didn't exist even that long ago.
Yeah. Yeah. Collective Shout recently just shared quotes from porn producers, and they're just frightening. It makes you physically sick
Mm,
to read them, because they pretty much they willfully acknowledge that they're harming women, that they've taken
mm,
this to the extremes, that there's actually nowhere further to go. Like, they've hit the bottom of the barrel. But of course
mm,
they're
mm.
intent on breaking through. And it's just so extraordinary. It's unthinkable that we've arrived here when we so call ourselves this enlightened progressive society that's interested in social justice and equality, and all these sorts of things, and yet this is just the most glaring disgrace in our society that's not addressed, as you say.
Yeah,
And I think for the
yeah.
reasons that you and I both know, is that it just cuts to the core of so many human hearts, and
Mm.
so many men. And it's like, how do we speak to it? Can I
I mean,
ask?
it's really hard. Oh, sorry. Go for it, Dan,
You go,
please.
you go, you go.
Well, it's really hard. I mean, when you read the news, and if you read about, say, a sex offender that's been arrested for sexually abusing children, for example, or not even that. So let's say they have been arrested for looking at images of sexual abuse, and the judge quite rightly says that this person who is watching these images, looking for these images, is creating a demand for the production
That's
of
right.
abuse of children. Now, what I can't understand is, why does nobody ever extend that argument towards women, that people that are buying and watching and indulging in videos of violence, raw violence against women, why is that argument never extended towards that? So anybody with a conviction of any child abuse offences is kept well away from children for at least 10, 15 years after their conviction has ended, or their time has been spent, or whatever. The same safeguards aren't applied to women, and I can't understand why we can argue that watching violence against children will stop you being allowed to interact with children, but watching violence against women, oh, that's fine. That's just a kink. That's okay.
Yeah.
It's not a big deal. And this is one of these contradictions that I just cannot get my head around.
Yeah, it's absolutely extraordinary, because I was even reading recently a book, and it was even talking to kind of sex positive feminists. But they then said, if you could date someone who was either a porn addict or didn't watch porn, who would you choose? And they all chose the person that doesn't watch porn. And these were women who obviously were very pro porn in the sex industry. And it's just extraordinary. And yeah, I'm so saddened that men make excuses for this and play it down or dismiss it. And for me, I'm just so grateful that you're speaking up and that we can have this conversation, James, you know. And I think for me, it's like, how do we stop this before it escalates, you know? And that's my biggest thing, is like, how do we engage young men to see the harms of this before it's too late? And the tragedy is that the global porn industry does prey on young men, you know, and it preys on their natural instincts and impulses. But you're right, and it's we might get too authoritarian, but I'm with you on, you know, like, I want to know which men are watching porn or addicted to porn or watch violent porn, because like, as far as I'm concerned, and like, I can't even imagine being a woman in this world having to negotiate that reality. Like, it's actually too
Oh,
much
I
to
mean,
bear, because I
imagine
don't,
being 13 years old and watching like 13, 14, and you're the guys at school on their phones, they're watching this stuff, and then
that's
they
right.
think that in order to be in an intimate relationship with somebody, you need to be smacked, choked, spat on, ejaculated over. Like, imagine like going through that as a young girl in this day and age. It must be horrific.
Yeah, I think it is. And I think the reality of this is too confronting. That's why people want to ignore it or choose to ignore it.
Mm,
Because I think the reality is, we would have to create such a radical change if we were to fully confront this for what it is, you know? It would
yeah,
completely
yeah,
reorder so much of society, and would require
yeah.
and demand so much from us, in particular as men, you know? But yeah, like, it just worries me that there are people watching this who are potentially police officers, judges, doctors, school
Mm.
teachers, you know, like, people who have other people entrusted to their care, you know, or that are put in positions to make sound judgments, and that require you to be fully human and recognize the people before you as fully human, as Robert Jensen said on an earlier interview, you know. So that's what worries me so much about this.
Well, the worst thing, Dan, is, I mean, you just said doctors, judges, police officers, maybe another profession. There's
Teachers.
actually porn for all of those scenarios. Like, there's porn for, like, if a policeman wants to watch porn of a police officer abusing a woman, there's porn of that.
Yeah,
And
there's
that's
nothing
the
that
worst
porn
thing, is
hasn't.
this industry.
Yeah.
Yeah, it takes any fantasy and anything that anybody wants to watch and indulge in and makes movies of it. And at what point? I mean, years ago they would argue that it's free speech, but at what point do we stop and think and take a step back and think, you know, this is actually pretty damaging one way or another, and we do something about it?
Well, it's not really speech, but we can discuss that at another point.
Yeah, well, that was the argument years ago.
The extraordinary thing is, as well, is like, pornography is the place that gets a hall pass for eroticizing every form of discrimination and marginalization,
Mm,
whether it's
yeah,
racism, homophobia, or anything else. It's where it gets a complete free pass, and obviously downright misogyny. But that's what I
yeah.
utterly incomprehensible at this moment, that it is the one place that gets a free pass on this, and people who kind of would flaunt their social justice credentials seem to not be concerned about this issue.
I mean, the thing for me is, when I think about this, if somebody produced videos of a Jewish person and another person shouting anti-Semitic slurs at them, no violence, no physical contact, whoever produced those videos would probably be in jail.
That's right.
Same if you produced a video of a black man and somebody shouting racist slurs at them, it'd probably get shut down as hate speech. People would go to jail.
Rightfully
We
so.
have a whole industry, exactly. We have a whole industry of men shouting sexist slurs at women whilst beating the snot out of them, and it's just entertainment. It's just the
It's
adult entertainment industry, and hey ho, we're okay with that.
Yeah, it's amazing that, hey, and I've learned so much from some brilliant feminists, no doubt, obviously my colleagues at Collective Sharp, but so many others. And I love some of the, you know, kind of witty pushback on all this, that it's like, why does the presence of a male erection kind of legitimize all this? Like, in any other
It's nuts.
context, it's not okay. But the moment that there's a male orgasm or male erection, we're okay with this.
That's it. It's fine.
And we got to say, I mean, I feel a bit like, did I just say that? Are we talking about this? But it's like, I feel like we just have to say it. We have to say it in just the obsceneness of what it is, like we just have to say the reality of what is actually going on here. And it just seems so absurd, but it's like that is actually what's happening. That is what this dynamic is. That is what this problem and injustice looks like right now. And something has to be done. To bring it back to the personal, for you in terms of like seeking help, like, do you believe that men can de-radicalize?
Oh, absolutely, absolutely. But the thing is, it just has to be I mean, I personally think it should be complete abstention from this stuff.
Yeah.
It's just too hard to watch a little bit of it. That's the thing. And even, I mean, there's the ethical issues around watching any of it at all. I personally, right. if all the porn in the world just stopped being produced tomorrow, I think the world would be a much better place. But
Absolutely.
We can't really. That's not an issue right now. We can't do that. But I think the real solution is yes. I mean, I've met people that, and even myself, I mean, when I was at my peak, I would watch porn 6-7 hours a night.
No.
I would stop eating. Yeah, I wouldn't eat for hours on end. I wouldn't be able to get up in the morning and go to work without watching porn. I couldn't go to bed at night without watching porn. I was at my peak. It just took over my life. And if somebody like me or others who's actually, I've met people that have even worse problems than I did. If they can stop, then it can be done. At the end of the day, a lot of it is just acknowledging that there was a gap in your life that you didn't know how to fill in a healthy way, and your go-to drug for that was porn. For other people, it's alcohol, it's gambling, but for some people like me, it happened to be porn that would fill that gap in my life. And once you have an understanding of that and how to live your life in a better and healthier way, it's really not that difficult to stop. I mean, it's hard till you get your first withdrawal and, you get quite moody and whatnot. But after that, it just becomes easier. And it's just like coming off any drug.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And for you with coming off, was that like a long time? Because obviously there's neuroplasticity, and that is the beautiful, hopeful message in this, is that just like we can rewire our brains towards pornography, we can rewire our brains to other things. For you, can we just get a ballpark as to how long that journey was, James?
It took me, I think, from absolutely deciding to quit to having a good, I think maybe 6 months of not watching porn. And by that point, like the things that used to excite me would just really turn me off.
Yeah.
And I'd, get really angry about the idea that I used to watch this stuff.
Yeah.
But a good 6 months. And this is why, like, if you see this a lot online on like the NoFap forums and other message boards with guys that are trying to stop, I honestly think if you just managed one way or another 6 months away from porn, you will wonder why you were ever doing it in the first place.
Yeah.
And you'll have all this free time then that you never had. You're not contributing to a really terrible industry involved in all kinds of unethical behavior. And you're kind of making the world a better place by not watching this stuff.
I agree.
And this is what I think people need to understand, that it's not just porn, it's the whole ecosystem around porn. It's porn, prostitution, trafficking, people that are making child sexual abuse material. It's a whole massive ecosystem. And by boycotting porn, you're actually making that ecosystem weaker. Yeah. And I think it's the bigger picture. It's about understanding that all of this stuff is intertwined. It doesn't exist in isolation.
That's right.
Or independently of each other. It all feeds. It's just one. It's like the porn is really the propaganda arm of the sex industry and the other things that people end up paying for or watching.
Yep.
It's not that by itself, and I think people need to understand that.
Yeah, absolutely. I think you've articulated that so well. You know, we sometimes use the language of like you're a patron of the sex and trafficking industry, like the sexual exploitation
Mm,
industry. And I think, you know, and again, as we've touched on, in such a socially conscious time in history where people want to buy ethical clothes or make sure their coffee or chocolate is ethically sourced, and they want to make all these consumer decisions, you know, to keep their
my
hands
favorite is
kind of.
vegan porn viewers, like vegan porn consumers, right? I mean, violence against animals. Oh no, no way. Violence against women. It's a kink.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, and that again just shows the inconsistencies of this issue. And I'm so grateful that you spoke to that, because that's obviously one of the motivating factors. And I've touched on this in previous discussions, you know, like that's sometimes one of the motivating forces for why young men will quit, because they like, I just don't want to contribute to this. As you say, they didn't use
Mm,
the language, but you know, they don't want to be part of the ecosystem that's fueling this, that's increasing the
yeah,
demand for it. And that's where we all have to just honestly stop and reflect. And as you say, like, what kind
yeah,
of world is this contributing to? Me watching pornography, and vice versa. What does a world without pornography look like? And whilst that is so far away right now, like there are the conversations that I think if we have on an individual, relational, and communal level, you know, and to start imagining that, because, you know, all you have to do, I'm sure, you know, James, is like if you go through YouTube comment sections or Reddit forums and you see guys who have quit
mm,
porn, like the positives which you've outlined are even more
yeah,
numerous. You know, like they tell you about
yeah,
what it's
yeah,
like to have the brain fog lifted, to be more motivated,
yeah.
more interested in actual dating and relationships and friendships in the real world, and
Oh yeah, oh
socially
yeah,
integrated again. And you know, just the freedom of not looking at every human, every woman through the lens of some pornified sexual
yeah.
scenario, you know,
Oh my goodness.
to be liberated
Yeah, I
from
mean,
that.
I think what a lot of young guys don't understand, so people that got into porn when they were 12, 13 or younger, before they've even had their first kiss, I think what many of them don't understand is having a real relationship
Yeah.
with a woman or a man that cares about you and loves you,
Mm,
and you can be vulnerable to each other. That's sexier than any of the porn in the world. And it's
yeah.
really hard to articulate that when now you can just click on any tube site and find a scene doing of a girl who looks however you want her to look, doing whatever you want her to do.
Hmm.
It's hard to articulate that kind of emotional intimacy side.
Yeah.
It's just that's really what the message should be. That
Yeah.
um, it's just not real.
That's right.
It's not like, if you consider, like, I mean, the way I would imagine going back to the Victorian era or even the 30s and telling people, okay, look, we now, as men, we de-stress by watching movies of women being sexually violated in every orifice. That's how we relax nowadays. They'd think you were crazy.
Yeah.
Like, it sounds nuts. Like, even just to say it, it
Yeah.
sounds nuts.
Yep.
Because like in days gone by, sex was something that you did, and even now, sex is something that you do. It's not something that you watch. It's something that you do. And I think a lot of guys forget is to actually be in a position where you are sexually intimate with a woman. You know, you need to be caring and affectionate and kind and put some effort in and be presentable. And that's too much work for a lot of guys these days.
Yeah. And obviously pornography, you know, as I always say, tells men that all women are available all the time, anywhere, anyhow, you know, and it doesn't matter how you treat them, they'll always be interested in sex, you know.
Mm,
And it's just so
mm.
far removed. And I think that's the biggest issue. And you used my favorite word before when you mentioned propaganda, because you know that's what this is. It sells lies about love, sex, intimacy, men, women, desire, pleasure. And unfortunately for young people, this is their primary sex education. But you know, as we've
Oh, it's
touched on,
nuts. It's
it's
nuts.
like, what
And
is
like porn is
actually
the only
education?
medium.
Yeah.
Oh, sorry, Dango.
No,
But
no,
porn is the only medium in the world where a man can groom his stepdaughter, or a man can groom a student, and he's not the bad guy. He's the
that's
good
right.
guy. And not only is he the good guy, you're actually cheering him on. You're not cheering him on. You're wishing you were that guy. And that's berserk that we've got to this point.
Yep. I think you articulate it so well. And again, what does that do to our capacity for empathy? You know, if we're not actually being able to identify with the suffering of others, and in actual fact, we're wanting to be the person violating another human, you know?
That's
And
it. That's it. And like when you read in the newspapers about, you know, men that get convicted of these kinds of offences, and the victims, you know, and you listen to the victim statements, and you just think this is an absurdly horrendous experience for this individual,
yep,
but it's been turned into a movie, a porn movie by pornographers, and I mean that's really sad for me that like the modern man now, we've got to a point where we are aroused by harm against women,
mm,
and I just wish this was like it was. I just can't. It's really hard to talk about that. How did we get here?
exactly.
Like I
Yep,
can see from a capitalist point of view, you know, the porn industry wants to keep making money and it has to keep escalating the nature of the material. But why did men go down this path?
that's
Like,
right.
why did we do
That's
this?
right.
Why did I, you know? And it's just really sad to think that this is such a big problem.
Yeah. That's the thing that I find just so abhorrent about all of this, and why I started this work many years ago, was because I just hated how mainstream culture appealed to the lowest common denominator of men, and men's most base and depraved instincts. And we're not even talking
Mm,
about pornography yet, you know, like that was what annoyed me about mainstream culture and what it presented as how to be a man, let alone what pornography is saying. And again, like there are brilliant feminists who have said, you know, like what is pornography saying about men, you know? And
mm,
I find that the hardest thing to grapple with, you know, and having stepped away from porn over a decade ago, it's like I just, yeah, to look back on it, it breaks my heart. It grieves me so much, because I just think like, what a shadowy existence for men, you know, and what a horrific way to wire ourselves and orientate what our lives are about. And that's not to, you know, judge individuals, but to say like the
mm.
state of this, we just have to want better for men. You know, we have to want better for the women and girls in our lives and for relationships. And yeah, I think it's just a tragedy. And like I said, I think it's just so much cultural grooming, and just this sense
Mm,
that this is something that's just been tolerated and tolerated. And it seems since the sexual revolution that everything that, as long as you can say that it arouses you, seems to be off limits from criticism. And
mm,
you know, there's the capitalism component, there's the traditional patriarchal dynamics, there's the reality of anatomy, but then there's other things as well, you know, that have been created culturally, you know. And for example, like this, we can't actually critique things that are to do with male arousal, you know. And I
mm.
think that it's just a horrific trick that's been played on society, and we just hope that more and more people wake up to it. But yeah, there's so many contributing factors. But I just know that, you know, for young men in particular, when I have the opportunity to engage with them, you know, like for the ones that get it, they want an out, they want to get off that kind of conveyor belt, you
Mm.
know, that's just taking them down at what they know is an ugly path, you know. And the stories just continue to mount up, you know. I get people message me even just this week telling me, you know, that they've had sexual experiences, this is both gay men, straight women, with men who are clearly addicted to porn, you know, because of what they've
Mm.
experienced. And for me, I'm just like, I talk about this in the abstract, because if I sit in it thinking too much about people that I care about or people that I come across, it's just too heartbreaking, you know, to think about how did we get here, you know, and the harm that is
Yeah.
being done. And like, as far as I'm concerned, this is the biggest, you know, global public health crisis we've got, you know, like
Oh,
it's as
damn right.
big as it
Damn
gets,
right.
because it impacts on everything and everyone and every relationship and every human person on so many levels. And
Yeah.
for me, like, that's why this series, that's why we need to say this, and we need more people speaking out. And I'm just so grateful that you've shared your story, because we obviously need more and more men to highlight this, to actually say
Mm.
there's so much better for us, and here's how we can go about doing that. And this is the better and the more beautiful and the more just and fair that we want you to strive for, you know. Can I
Yeah.
ask, can I ask for you, James, if you were speaking to your younger self, like what would you say? How would you encourage your younger self, or what advice would you give before you went down that path?
I mean, this all starts with objectification. All of this. I mean, this whole problem starts when you stop seeing women as fully formed, independent, sentient humans. That's when the problem begins. And I would have told myself, I mean, I had really dreadful social anxiety as a young man. So I think the real solution for me would have been to have more female friends, and just not treat them as they're different to men so much, and that the problem is society just fetishizes women and girls so much that
But
even as
anything
a
and
young man,
everything.
it's hard to break through that. Yeah, it's
Yeah,
hard to break through that message. It's hard. Like there's no counter message to all of that.
yeah, it
And
is.
that's
I
the problem. Even
know.
with young men today, like it's much. I think it's much harder nowadays
Yeah,
because it's
especially with
so much
social
worse.
media. It's just there's so much conditioning, because I know for Melinda and I, when we take the young people through a crash course on this stuff, we are showing them just mainstream media depictions of men versus women, and the objectification
Mm,
just screams from, every advertisement, every billboard, every TV and
yeah,
music show,
yeah.
and it
It's
starts
appalling,
there.
and the mixed messages are so bad.
Oh, well, that's exactly right. Like it is so bad, because here I am trying to encourage young men to have self-control, to respect women. And yet everywhere they look, that is not the case. And they're encouraged to,
Mm,
lose themselves, to be completely uninhibited sexually, to go after whatever they want,
yeah,
you know? And it is, I feel for them, like I'm not even upset with them, which sometimes I think I am, but it's like, no, I feel for you guys. You're in a social experiment that no other generation has
yeah,
faced, with pornography and social media. And it's cooking your brains, it's cooking your desires. And like, what hope do they have unless we, as like, to counter the radicalization, like we have to do the opposite, which is completely humanize young people, to
mm,
themselves and to one another. And for me, like, that's the task that is kind of before me whenever I'm in schools or speaking to a group, is like, how do we encourage them to humanize one another, to make sure they see the full humanity of themselves and other people, and in doing so humanize themselves. Because like, you cannot take any pleasure, or from the degradation of another human. Once you determine that someone is completely human, filled with dignity, equal to you, there is no way you can be aroused by them being dehumanized, by them being degraded.
yeah,
And
yeah,
that's the task that awaits all of us, and this next generation is inviting us to obviously speak out and reimagine that, and to do differently.
yeah. No, we've got a really big task ahead of us, but I think it will only change once the culture changes. I remember when I was younger, it was actually really uncool to look at porn. So back in the 90s, like if you looked at porn, it was more of a slight against your masculinity, in that you were not attractive enough to get real women. That
Yeah.
message has been completely turned upside down now,
Isn't
where
that
it's actually
fascinating?
really cool. It's
Yeah.
insane. It's really crazy. Like it's cool and mainstream and hip to look at porn. And if you don't look at porn, you're a weirdo. That's
Yeah.
that's
Yeah.
that's the
Yeah.
cultural message now.
Although
And
there
you
is,
read stories about um, like you read stories of people actually having sex and they can't orgasm until they've got a video of them having the sex. While they're having sex, then they can orgasm. And I
yeah, I
think
know. But
this
then
stuff is crazy.
it is crazy. But then, the self-interest gets involved, because obviously for the first time in human history, we're seeing young men with erectile dysfunction, as a result of pornography. And obviously that's
Yeah,
deeply uncool, that kind of cuts to the psyche of most men, or all men, to lose their virility in that sense. So part of me is like, those stories are being told and it's becoming more uncool. Obviously, like for me, I'm just obsessed with Kuma memes, which I don't know if you've come
yeah,
across,
yeah,
and
yeah.
so there is a countercultural pushback, because like with everything, if something's mainstream, it's no longer cool, and porn is as
Exactly.
mainstream as it gets. So I'm hoping that it's going to be punk to obviously reject porn, go down that path. And even fascinating, I was telling some of the feminists the other day, you're not going to believe who some of our new allies are, seeing these absolutely jacked bodybuilders telling their, tens of thousands and hundreds of thousands of followers on their Instagram, videos saying, go to bed, quit porn, drink water. And I was like, what? Quit porn? And I was like so encouraged that, they're even recognizing that. Then they're probably, I know for a fact, they're not doing it from the same systemic analysis that probably you and I share. But even still, it was encouraging to see other avenues where men were encouraging other men to say, this isn't good for you. This isn't actually who you want to be in the world. And I'm hoping that, again, more and more men will wake up to that. And in a sense, want to aspire to a healthier, more full masculinity, where porn is part of it.
There's just a real dearth of role models for young men right now, and a
Huge.
positive masculinity and positive sexual masculinity. And I think we just need more guys to talk about it, more famous, cool people to talk about it, not just
well, that's not us, but hopefully
like you and
some
I.
others will do it. But I agree with you. And, it's obviously pleasing when you see people like Terry Crews come out, Lamar Odom, NBA player, come out and speak about all this, and hoping that, there is just more and more who speak to this. And I'm obviously grateful for all you gents who have joined me so far in these conversations, and for every, conversation that goes up, I get incredible feedback, and so thankful for, other young men being exposed to this message and being comforted and encouraged that they're not alone, And for me, that's where it all starts. And so, I'm so thankful for that. And I'm thankful for you, James, to share your story with us. I just...
Thanks, Dan, for having me. But it's really great work that you're doing, because, it's been women that have been leading the porn movement for years. And I think men need to understand that this stuff it's really damaging to women, but it's really, really damaging to men. And I probably wouldn't have been motivated to speak out about it or to work with Collective Shout if I hadn't seen what I'd seen in the fellowship meetings that I go to. It's just abominable. It really, really is. And
the problem is people don't hear about that, and that's why I'm so grateful that you've written your blog, which I'll make sure we circulate again. And, I'm so grateful that you've spoken here, because otherwise it's just kind of swept under the rug. People don't realize the harms until it's too late, even though now there's a groundswell of so many people coming forward saying, this is how porn harmed me or my relationship.
Exactly. And we just need to publicize that and discuss it more. And unfortunately, the limits of people's knowledge of these issues is they read about somebody in the newspaper or online that was convicted of a sexual offense, or they know somebody that's really, really, really creepy in real life, and that's the limits of their knowledge of how a kind of warped, pornified sexuality. I mean, they can't even make the connection between somebody committing a sex crime and porn. They never ever talk about that. Nobody ever discusses that when we're seeing constantly now in the news thousands of men being arrested and tried for sex crimes. And why is everybody skirting over the porn issue? The police know it's porn. There's a charity in the UK that helps reform sex offenders. On their website, they say it's porn. Everybody knows this is what is driving it, but nobody's actually doing anything about it. So we have to be the guys that are doing it.
Well, I thank you. And I thank you so much for your time and for sharing. And I agree, all of us men, no matter what our platform or influence is, to speak honestly, to speak openly about these issues as you have, and you've led by example. And for those listening, I hope that this would be of encouragement for you, that you're not alone, that there are others who are resisting porn and porn culture, because we just want better for ourselves, for other men in our lives, and obviously for the women and girls who have to interact with men. So I just want to thank you, James. I thank you so much for your time and your realness. And I really hope this message really impacts a lot of people. So thank you.
No, thank you, Dan. Thanks for having me.